The big stirring spoon should be hanging in its spot. What will the children wear? Any torn shifts or stockings should be identified now, set aside for mending tonight while there's candlelight, if they can afford it. Is there water in the house? Not just for tonight, but enough for the morning face washing, the breakfast cooking, the first tasks of the day. This kind of evening preparation wasn't written in housekeeping books because it was considered too obvious to mention, but travelers from cities, when they visited rural households, sometimes commented on it with surprise. This sense that the evening wasn't rest time, it was preparation time. And here's something that really struck me when I was researching this. The psychology of it. Living by the sun's schedule meant you were never really in control of your time. Not fully. You couldn't say, "Oh, I'll just work a bit later tonight and sleep in tomorrow." If you stayed up late, you were burning expensive candles or straining your eyes in dim firelight. And morning came when it came, whether you were rested or not. The rooster didn't care about your sleep debt. So, there was this constant low-level anxiety, especially in late autumn when the days were getting shorter. Every sunset came a little earlier. Every morning you had a little less time to get things done, and winter was coming with its long nights and cold, and the need to stay indoors more. Women would talk about it in their letters and diaries. This feeling of the days slipping away, this pressure to make the most of every moment of daylight. One woman in 1768 wrote to her sister, "I find myself quite vexed on cloudy days, for it seems I lose 2 hours of light that I can ill afford to waste." 2 hours of light worth writing about, worth being vexed over. Can you imagine valuing daylight that much? But here's where it gets interesting. Because women adapted, they got creative. If you visit historical houses from this period, you'll notice something. The windows are huge relative to the size of the rooms, especially on the east and west sides of the house. That's not an accident. That's not just architectural style. They built houses to capture every possible ray of sun. And inside, the layout mattered too. Work that required seeing fine details, sewing, mending, reading, writing that happened near windows always. You'll see it in paintings from the period. Women at spinning wheels positioned right by the window. Girls learning to sew on a bench that catches the afternoon light. The rest of the house could be dim. The bedroom, the storage areas, the hallway, those could be dark. But the places where detailed work happened, those needed light, and during the day, people moved their work to follow the sun. Morning tasks happened on the east side of the house. Afternoon tasks migrated west. It was a kind of domestic choreography, this daily dance with daylight. Now, let's get back to Sarah as that last bit of usable twilight fades. She can't see the fine details anymore. Can't thread a needle or read small print, but she can still see shapes, can still move around safely, can still finish the larger tasks. So, this is when she might do a final walk around the property. Check that the garden gate is latched. Make sure no tools got left out in the field. Look in on the animals one last time. And this is when she'd be very aware of the sounds because as light fades, hearing sharpens. She's listening for anything unusual. The sound of her husband or sons finishing up work in the barn. The sound of her daughters getting the younger children inside. The sound of neighbors calling to each other across the yards. Everyone doing the same evening dance. In rural areas, you could actually hear the sunset happening across the community. Animals being penned, doors shutting, voices calling, children being summoned inside. One man who grew up in 1780s Virginia later wrote about this in his memoirs. The sound of evening was like a symphony, each household playing its part, and you knew when all the notes had been played that the day was truly done. I love that image, this communal sunset, this shared transition from day to night. And then there's the moment when Sarah steps back inside her house and closes the door behind her. That's it. Day is done. The outside world is now locked out until morning. Whatever didn't get done will have to wait. Whatever got forgotten is just forgotten until dawn. And now begins a different kind of evening work. The kind that happens by firelight and candlelight. The kind that's just as essential, but somehow even more exhausting because you're already tired. And now you have to work in dim light, and your eyes hurt, and you've been on your feet since before sunrise. But that meal needs to be warmed. Those children need to be fed. That mending needs to happen. Those letters need to be written. That bread needs to be set to rise for tomorrow. Life doesn't stop just because the sun went down. It just gets harder. And here's what I find most moving about this whole thing. Women in the 1700s didn't think of themselves as particularly strong or resilient. If you read their letters and diaries, they're constantly worried they're not doing enough, not managing well enough, not keeping up. They didn't know they were living through something we'd look back on and find extraordinary. They just knew the sun was setting and there was work to be done, and the candles were expensive, and tomorrow would come whether they were ready or not. So, as we move deeper into this story of evening life in the 1700s, I want you to hold on to that image. Sarah at her window watching the light fade, her mind already racing through everything that needs to happen next. Because that moment, that transition from day to night, that's where our story really begins. In the next part, we're going to step inside the warm kitchen and see exactly what happened when supper time arrived. And trust me, it's not what you'd expect. The evening meal in the 1700s was its own little world of tradition, strategy, and making do. But for now, just picture that race against darkness, that precious light slipping away, and all those women in all those houses dancing that same careful dance with the sunset every single evening for their entire lives. Hashtag part 2, the evening meal. So Sarah's inside now. The door is closed against the darkening October evening. And the first thing she needs to do before anything else before sitting down, before even taking off her outdoor shawl, is deal with supper. Now, when I say supper, I need you to completely forget what that word means to you. Because in the 1700s, supper wasn't dinner. It wasn't the main meal. It wasn't even particularly important in terms of nutrition or variety. Supper was something else entirely. It was leftovers. But here's the thing. Leftovers elevated to an art form. Let me explain. The main meal of the day in the 1700s was called dinner. And dinner happened between noon and 3 in the afternoon. That's when you'd have your stew, your roasted meat if you could afford it, your vegetables, your bread. That's when families gathered for the substantial, filling meal that would fuel the rest of the day's work. Supper, on the other hand, happened sometime between 6 and 8 in the evening. And it was almost always whatever was left from dinner, warmed up. Now you might be thinking, that sounds depressing. Cold leftovers for your evening meal. But here's where it gets fascinating. Because the way women manage supper reveals something brilliant about household economy in this period. Think about it. By evening, everyone's exhausted. The light is terrible. Candles are expensive. The fire needs to be managed carefully because you can't let it go out overnight. So, the absolute last thing anyone wants to do is start cooking from scratch. Instead, what Sarah would have done, what her mother taught her, what she's now teaching her daughters is strategic meal planning centered around the hearth. That big stew pot that's been sitting over the fire since this morning, still there. The fire's been kept low all day, just high enough to keep the contents warm, but not burning. The stew has been essentially maintaining itself. And that's the genius of it. One pot, one fire, continuous heat, minimal supervision. Let me paint you a more specific picture. It's mid-October 1743. Remember our Sarah? She made a pea and salt pork stew this morning. She started it at dawn right after breakfast. Dried peas that had been soaking overnight. Chunks of salted pork from the barrel in the cellar. An onion from the storage. Maybe some carrots if they haven't all been eaten yet. Herbs from the summer's drying. Thyme, sage. She got it boiling, then pushed the pot to the side of the hearth where the heat was gentler. And there it sat all day while she did everything else. Feeding chickens, churning butter, mending, spinning, supervising her daughter's work, 1,000 tasks. She checked it occasionally, gave it a stir, added a bit of water if it looked too thick, but mostly it just cooked itself. By noon, it was ready. The family ate their dinner portions. They soaked up the broth with bread. The children got seconds because growing bodies need fuel. And then, and this is key, Sarah left a good third of the pot untouched. That remainder has been sitting there all afternoon. The peas have gotten softer. The pork has broken down even more. The flavors have had 6 extra hours to melt together. Honestly, by supper time, that stew probably tastes better than it did at noon. But warming it for supper isn't quite as simple as just ladling it out. There's a process. First, Sarah needs to assess the fire. Has it stayed strong enough? Is there enough heat to warm the stew through? Or does she need to add a log? Coax the flames up a bit. This is actually a delicate judgment call. Add too much wood and you're wasting fuel, creating more heat than you need, making the room uncomfortably hot. Add too little and the stew stays lukewarm, which nobody wants. Sarah's been doing this for 20 years. She knows her hearth like you know your oven settings. She knows exactly where to position the pot, how long it'll take, what the stew should look like when it starts to bubble around the edges. While the stew warms, she is slicing bread. Yesterday's bread most likely because bread was typically baked once or twice a week, not daily. It's a bit dry, but that's actually perfect for soaking up stew. The children prefer it that way. They like using bread as a spoon, pushing it around the wooden bowl until it's saturated with broth. Now, I mentioned wooden bowls, and that's worth pausing on because tableware tells us a lot about how supper happened. Most families didn't have individual plates or bowls for every person. The wealthy might, but average households, they shared. Father might have his own bowl. Mother might have one, but the children often ate from a common dish, or they'd share between 2 or 3. And here's something that surprised me when I learned it. Individual portions of meat and vegetables weren't really a thing until later in the 1700s, and even then, mostly for well-to-do families. For most people, you ate communally. The stew pot or the bowl sat in the center. You had your hunk of bread. You dipped, you ate, you dipped again. It was actually quite intimate when you think about it. Everyone's bread going into the same bowl, everyone's hands reaching toward the center. There was no such thing as my food and your food. It was all our food. Can you imagine trying to get modern kids to share a meal that way without dividing it up into separate portions? It's a completely different relationship with eating. But let's get back to Sarah's kitchen. The stew is bubbling now. The bread is sliced. And this is where the social dynamic of supper gets interesting. Because unlike dinner, which was somewhat formal, everyone gathered, Father said grace, there was a certain order to things. Supper was looser, more casual. People might not all eat at the same time. If Father and the older sons were still finishing evening chores in the barn, they'd eat when they came in. Mother and daughters might eat earlier because they had their own evening work to do, spinning, sewing, mending. Younger children might eat, and then be put straight to bed. Older children might eat quickly, and then sit by the fire with their handwork. Supper wasn't so much a meal as it was refueling. It was practical. It was necessary, but it didn't have the ceremony of dinner. And I think there's something kind of beautiful about that informality, because it meant the evening could unfold more naturally. You weren't locked into this rigid everyone must eat at the same time schedule. You adapted to the rhythms of work and light and energy. Now I want to talk about what happened to the pot after supper because this is where you really see the economy of household management. Whatever's left in that pot, maybe a quarter of the original stew, that's tomorrow's breakfast. Or it's tomorrow's dinner if you add more ingredients. Or it's the base for a completely different dish. Nothing was wasted. Nothing. If there was too much left and it would spoil, it might go to the pigs or the dog. But that was rare because women had this incredibly precise sense of proportions. They knew how many servings a pot would yield. They knew how much their family would eat at dinner versus supper. They knew how to stretch ingredients across multiple meals. It's almost like they had this internal spreadsheet running at all times, not written down. Most women couldn't have explained their math if you asked them, but they knew. Deep in their bones, they knew. One historian who studied colonial household accounts found that the best household managers could make 1 pound of salted meat combined with dried peas and vegetables feed a family of 6 across 2 full days. That's 12 meals from ingredients that cost maybe a few pennies. That's not just frugal, that's genius. But here's what I find most striking about supper in the 1700s. It reveals how different their relationship with food was. We're used to variety, right? We expect different meals every night. If you served your family leftovers 2-3 nights in a row, they'd probably stage a rebellion. But in the 1700s, consistency was comforting. Knowing what you were going to eat meant one less thing to worry about. The same stew for dinner and supper, maybe with different bread or a different vegetable on the side if you were lucky. That was just normal. And more than that, it was strategic because cooking from scratch twice a day would have been impossibly labor-intensive. It would have required maintaining a hot fire all day. It would have demanded attention that women simply didn't have to give. The one pot cook once eat twice approach freed up time and energy for everything else that needed doing. The spinning, the preserving, the animal care, the child care, the endless list of tasks. Supper being simple wasn't a failure of imagination or a sign of poverty, though poverty certainly limited options. It was intelligent household management. Let me tell you about one specific woman whose diary survived. Her name was Ruth Henshaw, and she lived in Leicester, Massachusetts in the late 1700s. She kept meticulous records of her daily life. And you know what she mentions over and over in her evening entries? How tired she is by supper time. Warm the remains of our dinner stew. The children ate what remained of the pork and turnips. Supper was hasty, as I had spinning to finish. That word hasty. She uses it a lot. Not in an apologetic way. Just matter of fact. Supper was hasty because there were 3 more hours of work to do before bed. And elaborate meal preparation didn't fit into that equation. And I think about Ruth Henshaw warming her leftover stew by firelight, probably doing it with one hand while her other hand was already reaching for the spinning wheel or the mending basket. And I think about how she didn't feel guilty about it. There was no Instagram to make her feel bad that her meal wasn't photogenic. There were no cooking shows suggesting she should try 17 new recipes this week. There was just this is supper, it's warm, it's filling, now let's move on to the next thing. What a relief that must have been in its own way. Of course, not every supper was leftover stew. Sometimes it was leftover roasted meat with bread and cheese. Sometimes it was porridge, cornmeal mush with milk, maybe sweetened with molasses if the family could afford it. Wealthier families might have had more variety. A supper table might include cold meats, pickles, cheese, bread, perhaps some preserves. Still not cooked fresh, but more selection. And on special occasions, Sundays, holidays, when company came, supper might be elevated. You might make fresh Jonna cakes on the hearth. You might bring out the good preserves. You might serve tea. But for ordinary evenings, from Monday through Saturday, week after week, month after month, supper was practical. It was economical. It was whatever could be managed with minimal fire, minimal light, and minimal energy. And that wasn't settling. That was survival. That was strategy. Here's the other thing about supper. It happened by firelight, not candlelight. Remember, candles were expensive. So unless you were wealthy, or unless it was a special occasion, you didn't light candles just for eating. You used the light from the hearth fire, which means supper happened in this warm, flickering, somewhat dim environment. You couldn't see details clearly. Faces were half in shadow. The food itself was more sense than seen. The smell, the heat, the taste. And I wonder sometimes what that did to the experience of eating. Did it make meals more contemplative, more focused on flavor rather than presentation? Did it create a particular kind of intimacy? Everyone huddled in that circle of firelight. Or was it just normal? So normal that nobody even thought about it. Probably the latter, but I like to imagine the former. So Sarah's family has eaten their supper. The bowls are stacked near the water bucket to be washed, though that might wait until morning depending on energy levels. The leftover stew has been set aside. The fire has been checked and adjusted. And now the evening's real work begins. Because supper was just the intermission. It was the brief pause between the daylight work and the candlelight work, between outdoor labor and indoor labor. And what happened next in those hours between supper and sleep, that's where the story gets really interesting. That's where you see women's work in its truest form. Necessary, skilled, relentless, and almost completely invisible to history, but not invisible to us. We're going to look closely. We're going to see exactly what filled those evening hours after the supper bowls were set aside. Stay with me because the night is just beginning. Hashtag part 3. Candle making season. There's a particular smell that marked the arrival of autumn in the 1700s. Not pumpkin spice. They didn't have that. Not wood smoke, though that was everywhere. No, the smell that told you autumn had truly arrived was the smell of rendering tallow, melted animal fat, hot, slightly rancid, unmistakable. And for women, That smell meant one thing. It was time to make candles. Now, I know what you're thinking. Candles? That's what we're talking about now. But trust me, this is one of the most fascinating pieces of the whole evening life puzzle. Because candles weren't just about light. They were about survival. They were about planning. They were about a woman's ability to literally see her family through winter. Let me show you what I mean. The candle-making season typically ran from late October through early November. And the timing wasn't arbitrary. It was based on some very practical calculations. First, you needed animal fat, lots of it, and that came from butchering season, which happened in autumn when the weather turned cool enough that meat wouldn't spoil before you could preserve it. When families slaughtered cattle or sheep, and this was usually a community affair with neighbors helping each other, the women saved every scrap of fat. The hard fat around the kidneys, which was the best quality. The softer fat from other areas. Fat trimmed for meat during preservation. All of it went into barrels or crocks, stored and accumulating through the year. By late October, you had your year's supply of fat ready. And now you needed to act fast. Here's why the timing mattered so much. In summer, tallow, that's rendered animal fat, won't solidify properly. It's too hot. You dip your wick into the melted tallow, pull it out, and instead of the fat cooling into a nice smooth layer, it would just drip right back off. You'd end up with a lumpy, misshapen mess. In deep winter, it's too cold to work comfortably. Your hands would freeze. The tallow would harden too quickly. The whole process would be miserable. But late autumn, perfect. Cool enough that the tallow sets quickly on the wick. Warm enough that you can still work outdoors or in an open shed without freezing. Plus, and this is the crucial part, you needed to make your candle supply before the days got truly short. Because making candles requires daylight, you need to see what you're doing. And once winter arrived with its 4:30 sunsets, you'd be racing darkness every single day just to keep up with daily chores. So autumn was your window, your one chance to prepare for the 6 months of darkness ahead. Now, let me walk you through the actual process, because it was far more complex than you might think. First, you had to render the fat. Raw animal fat isn't usable as is. It's full of impurities, bits of meat, membranes, blood. It smells awful. If you tried to make candles from it, they'd smoke terribly and smell even worse. So, women would take that collected fat and put it in a large iron kettle, the same one they used for laundry or soap making, thoroughly cleaned, and add water. Then, they'd heat it over an outdoor fire slowly for hours. The fat would melt and rise to the top. The impurities would sink or dissolve in the water. You'd skim off the clean yellowish tallow from the surface and put it into another kettle. This rendering process might take a full day or more, depending on how much fat you had, and you had to watch it constantly because if the fat got too hot, it would scorch. Scorched tallow made terrible candles that gave off black smoke and an acrid smell. One woman in 1757 described it in her diary. Spent the day rendering fat. My eyes burn from the smoke and my back aches from the stirring. But the tallow came out clean and pale. Thank the Lord. That's the reality. It was hard, uncomfortable work, but necessary. Once you had clean, rendered tallow, you could actually make the candles. And there were two main methods, dipping and molding. Dipping was the most common for average households. You'd take your kettle of melted tallow and suspend it over a steady flame to keep it liquid. Then you'd take a candle rod, basically a stick with notches cut into it, and tie your wicks to it. The wicks were usually made from twisted cotton or linen threads, sometimes hemp. And here's where it got meditative in a strange way. You dip the wicks into the hot tallow. Pull them out. Wait for the tallow to cool and harden. Dip again. Wait. Dip again. Wait. Each dip added a thin layer. You needed dozens of dips to build up a candle thick enough to burn for a reasonable amount of time. How long did this take? A good estimate from historical records suggests that making 12 decent-sized tallow candles by dipping took about 3 to 4 hours of continuous work. And remember, the average household needed roughly 300 candles to get through the year. That's 25 dozen. That's 75 to 100 hours of just dipping candles. Now you see why women enlisted their daughters to help. This wasn't a one-person job. This was an all-hands-on-deck situation. The alternative was molding, which was faster but required equipment. Candle molds were typically made of tin or pewter, rows of tubes you'd pour the tallow into with wicks already positioned down the center. The advantage, you could make 6 or 12 candles at once. Pour the tallow, wait for it to cool completely, pop them out, repeat. Much faster than dipping. The disadvantage, molds were expensive. Not every family could afford them, and they had to be cleaned carefully after each use, which added time. So, most rural households stuck with dipping. It was free if labor-intensive. And honestly, after doing it year after year since girlhood, women got quite skilled at it. They could dip multiple rods at once, rotating through them, never waiting idle while tallow cooled. There's something almost rhythmic about it when you see historical demonstrations. Dip, lift, move to the next rod. Dip, lift, move, like a dance. A slow, slightly smelly, exhausting dance. But here's what really struck me when I was researching this. The anxiety around it, because candles weren't just convenient. They were essential, and making them was the only time all year you could do it properly. If you got sick during candle making season, you were in trouble. If the weather turned unexpectedly cold or wet, you were in trouble. If you misjudged how much tallow you had, or if your candles turned out poorly, and you had to start over, you were in trouble. And trouble meant facing winter with insufficient light. It meant going to bed at 6 in the evening because you couldn't afford to burn through your candle supply too quickly. It meant your children couldn't do their evening chores properly. It meant you couldn't sew or mend or spin in the evenings. One historical account from Pennsylvania describes a family who failed to make enough candles one autumn due to illness. The father wrote, "We lived like beasts that winter, rising and sleeping with the sun, for we had no light to extend our days." Imagine that pressure, knowing that this one task performed in these few weeks would determine the quality of your life for the next 6 months. And the candles themselves, they weren't great, even when properly made. Tallow candles were smoky. They gave off a greasy smell as they burned. They dripped constantly unless you kept the wick perfectly trimmed. They had a low melting point, so if you placed one too close to the fire, it would bend and slump. And the light they gave, weak flickering. That statistic I mentioned earlier about 7 candles making a room luminous and splendid, those were tallow candles. 7 of them together produced maybe the equivalent of one modern 60-watt bulb. But here's the thing, they were still precious because even weak light was infinitely better than no light at all. Women would carefully store their finished candles in cool, dark places, basements if they had them, pantries, anywhere mice couldn't get to them. Yes, mice would eat tallow candles if given the chance, and they'd ration them carefully through the winter. 1 candle per evening for an average family, maybe 2 if there was important work that needed doing. Special occasions might warrant 3. Every candle represented hours of labor. Every candle burned was an investment consumed. Now, things improved somewhat in the early 1700s when someone discovered bayberry candles. Bayberry bushes grow wild along the Atlantic coast from New England down through the Carolinas. And their berries, when boiled, release a greenish wax that's harder than tallow, burns cleaner, and smells pleasant, almost herbal. Colonial women living near the coast started experimenting with it. The process was similar to making tallow candles, but required even more patience because you needed an enormous quantity of berries to get even a small amount of wax. Some estimates suggest it took about 15 pounds of bayberries to produce 1 pound of wax. And gathering 15 pounds of berries meant hours of picking from thorny bushes in autumn weather. But the resulting candles, so much better. They didn't smoke as much. They didn't smell like rendered fat. They burned cleaner and brighter. Naturally, they became special occasion candles. You'd save your bayberry candles for when the minister came to visit, for Christmas, for births and weddings, for moments that deserve better light. The rest of the year you made do with tallow. And then in the mid-1700s came the discovery that would change everything. Spermaceti, sperm whales, those massive creatures hunted in the Atlantic and Pacific, have a cavity in their heads filled with a waxy oil. When crystallized, this spermaceti makes the finest candles imaginable. Hard, bright burning, nearly smokeless, no smell. But here's the catch. They were phenomenally expensive. Only the wealthy could afford spermaceti candles regularly. For average families, they were completely out of reach. So the class divide extended even to candlelight. Wealthy homes could be bright in the evening, lit by clean-burning spermaceti candles. Poor and middle-class homes made do with smoky, smelly tallow, rationed carefully. Even something as basic as being able to see after dark was determined by how much money you had. Does that seem unfair? It should, because it was. Let me bring this back to our friend Sarah, the woman we started with in October 1743. She spent 3 weeks that autumn making candles with her 2 eldest daughters. They rendered the year's accumulated tallow. They spent hours dipping and redipping until their shoulders ached and their fingers were stiff. They made 287 candles. Sarah counted them carefully as she packed them away in the cellar. She did the math in her head. She'd been doing this calculation every year for 2 decades. 287 candles, roughly 1 per night from November through April, with a few extras for emergencies or special occasions. It would be enough, barely, if they were careful. If nobody got sick and needed a candle burning all night. If no disaster struck. And as she closed the cellar door on those carefully stacked candles, she felt what every woman felt at the end of candle-making season. Relief mixed with anxiety. Relief that the work was done. Anxiety about whether it would be enough because there wouldn't be another chance to make more until next autumn. This was it. You know what I find most moving about this whole thing? The fact that making candles was such a defining part of women's autumn work that historians can date historical documents by references to it. A letter that mentions, "We began the candle making yesterday," can be dated to late October or early November with reasonable certainty. A diary entry about finishing the last of the candles suggests early November. It was that universal, that predictable, that essential. Every woman in the 1700s from Quebec to Georgia participated in this ritual. Rich women supervised their servants doing it. Poor women did it themselves with their daughters, but everyone made candles in autumn. It was as fundamental to the rhythm of the year as planting in spring or harvest in fall. And yet, if you ask most people today about what women did in the 1700s, they probably couldn't tell you about candle-making season. It's been forgotten, lost in the bigger stories about war and politics and famous men. But for the women who lived it, this was life. This was what determined whether their winter evenings would be bearable or bleak. So now you understand why that smell of rendering tallow was so significant. It meant winter preparation was happening. It meant women were doing the work that would light their homes for the next 6 months. And every evening when Sarah lit one of those carefully made candles, she was burning hours of her own labor. She was quite literally consuming her autumn work to illuminate her winter nights. That's a different relationship with light than we have, isn't it? When you flip a switch, and it just happens, instant and unlimited and cheap. But in the 1700s, light was finite, personal, earned through labor and planning and skill. And we haven't even talked yet about what happened once those candles were lit. once the evening truly began, because that's where the story deepens. That's where we see what women actually did with those precious hours of candlelight. Stay close. We're about to step into the circle of light and see evening work as it really was. Hashtag part 4. Working by candlelight. The candle is lit. Finally, it's maybe 7 in the evening now. Supper is finished. The autumn darkness has settled completely outside. And Sarah reaches for her tinderbox, strikes the flint against steel, coaxes a spark onto charred cloth, blows gently until it catches, and finally, carefully lights one of those precious candles she made just weeks ago. And the room doesn't exactly brighten. That's the first thing we need to understand about candlelight in the 1700s. It wasn't bright. It wasn't even close to what we consider adequate light. It was just barely enough to keep you from being completely blind. Let me put this in perspective for you. A modern LED bulb, the kind you probably have in your house, produces somewhere around 800 to 1600 lumens. That's the measurement of visible light. Even an old-fashioned incandescent bulb gives you around 800 lumens. A single tallow candle in the 1700s, about 12 lumens. 12. That means you'd need roughly 65 to 70 tallow candles burning simultaneously to equal one modern light bulb. Now remember what I mentioned earlier about that 18th century observer who said a room with 7 candles appeared luminous and splendid. With our modern understanding, that room had maybe 84 lumens total. That's about the brightness of a single standard light bulb. And that was considered impressive. Most evenings, most families burned 1 candle, maybe 2 if absolutely necessary, which means they were living with 12 to 24 lumens of light for the entire evening. Can you even imagine? Here's an experiment you could try at home if you wanted to understand what they experienced. Wait until full darkness. Turn off every single light in your house, every lamp, every LED, every glowing clock or appliance. Get yourself 1 candle, a modern one, which actually burns brighter than tallow did. Light it. Sit down with a book or some sewing. Try it for 10 minutes. Just 10. Your eyes will adjust, sure. Humans are remarkably adaptable, but you'll notice things. The way the light barely reaches beyond a 3-foot radius. The way shadows jump and flicker with every air current. The way you have to hold your book or your work at just the right angle to see it at all. The way your eyes start to strain and water after just a few minutes. Now imagine doing that every single evening from October through April for hours, night after night after night. That was normal life. But the dim light wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the cost. See, we've talked about how much labor went into making candles, but we haven't talked about how expensive that labor made them in economic terms. Let's do some historical math. A skilled worker in the mid-1700s might earn about 20 to 30 pounds per year. That's British currency, which was used in the colonies. An unskilled laborer might make 10 to 15 pounds per year. A pound of tallow, which would make roughly 4 decent-sized candles, cost about 6 pence in most colonial markets. That's 1/40th of a pound sterling. So if you needed 300 candles for the year, that's 75 pounds of tallow, which would cost you around 37 shillings and 6 pence, nearly 2 pounds. For a laborer making 10 pounds per year, that's 1/5 of his annual income. 1/5 just for light. And remember that's if you bought the tallow. Most families made their own candles from their own livestock, which meant the cost was in labor and opportunity. That you could have used for soap or sold for cash instead went to candles. Every candle represented a choice. Every evening's light was an economic decision. This is why people in the 1700s had such a different relationship with darkness than we do. We're afraid of the dark in an abstract way. It's spooky. It's unsettling. It's associated with danger. But we can banish it instantly whenever we want at virtually no cost. They lived with darkness as a constant companion. Darkness was the default state. Light was the rare exception that had to be carefully rationed. And this shaped everything about evening activities. For instance, families would gather around the single candle, not metaphorically, literally. You'd cluster as close as possible to that small circle of light, because 3 feet away you couldn't see anything useful. This is actually where the phrase, candlelit circle, comes from. It wasn't poetic. It was descriptive. The light formed a circle, and you stayed within it. Now wealthy families had options that changed this dynamic considerably. If you could afford multiple candles, say 5 or 6 burning at once, you could actually spread out a bit. Different people could work on different tasks in different corners of the room. And if you were truly wealthy, you might have candelabras or chandeliers that held a dozen candles. You might even, and this was the height of luxury, use beeswax candles instead of tallow. Beeswax candles were extraordinary by the standards of the time. They burned brighter and cleaner than tallow. They didn't smoke as much. They smelled pleasant like honey. They lasted longer. And they cost roughly 4 times as much as tallow candles. So beeswax was reserved for churches, wealthy households, and special occasions. The average family might never burn a beeswax candle in their entire lives except at church. Can you imagine living in a world where the quality of your evening light literally depended on how much money you had? Where wealthy families could see clearly and work comfortably in the evening, while poor families squinted in dim, smoky light. That was reality. Class inequality extended even to something as basic as being able to see after dark. And then there's the most remarkable innovation of the mid-1700s. Mirrors and reflective surfaces. Women, and it was usually women who figured this out, discovered that if you placed a mirror or a piece of polished metal behind a candle, you could nearly double the effective light it gave off. The reflection created the illusion of a second candle without the cost of actually burning one. So, in better-off households, you'd see candlesticks designed with reflective backs, or small mirrors positioned strategically behind candles, or even sheets of tin polished until they shone, hung on walls to bounce light back into the room. One inventory from a 1762 estate in Virginia lists tin sconces for maximizing candlelight as valuable enough to be specifically mentioned and valued. People were so desperate for more light that they invented ways to multiply the light they had. It's actually quite ingenious when you think about it. But let's talk about what it was actually like to work by candlelight, because this is where theory meets exhausting reality. Reading by candlelight was possible, but difficult. The text had to be held at exactly the right distance and angle. Too far, and you couldn't see the letters. Too close, and your own shadow blocked the light. You'd constantly be adjusting position, trying to find that sweet spot. And after about 20 or 30 minutes, your eyes would start to hurt. The constant focusing, the dim light, the flickering, it was genuinely straining. Historical records show that sustained reading was considered bad for the eyes. And they were right. Extended reading in poor light does cause eye strain and can contribute to vision problems. One Massachusetts minister in 1749 wrote a letter to his son advising him not to read by candlelight for more than half an hour at a stretch, lest you damage your sight permanently as I have done. This wasn't superstition. This was genuine medical observation based on lived experience. Sewing and mending by candlelight was even more challenging. Threading a needle in that dim, flickering light, nearly impossible for anyone over 40. Your close-up vision naturally declines with age. And even young people struggle to see the needles in 12 lumens of jumping candlelight. So women developed strategies. They'd thread multiple needles during daylight and stick them in a pincushion ready for evening use. They'd work on projects that didn't require seeing tiny details, darning stockings with thick wool, for instance, rather than embroidery. They'd also position themselves very carefully. Sit with a candle on your dominant side at just the right height. Hold your work at an angle that caught the most light. Turn every few minutes to avoid eye fatigue. And they'd work together. Daughters would thread needles for mothers whose eyes were going. Mothers would hold the candle while daughters did the detail work. The whole family became a kind of cooperative light management system. But even with all these strategies, needlework in the evening was slow, difficult, and frustrating. What might take 30 minutes in good daylight could easily take 2 hours by candlelight. And here's something that really struck me, the constant awareness of the candle itself. When you're working by a single candle, you're always conscious of it. Is it burning evenly? Is the wick getting too long because that creates smoke and wastes wax through dripping? Is there a draft that's making it flicker more than usual? Is it getting dangerously short? Women would trim the wick several times an hour using special scissors called snuffers. If you didn't trim the wick regularly, it would create a large smoky flame that wasted tallow and blackened the air. And you'd constantly be gauging how much candle was left. because once it burned down, you had a decision to make. Light another one and continue working, or call it a night, and save the rest of your supply. Most nights, unless the work was truly urgent, you saved the supply. You worked as long as one candle lasted, and when it guttered out, that was your signal. Time for bed. The candle literally set your schedule. It governed when your evening ended. Let me tell you about a specific woman named Abigail Lyman. She lived in Northampton, Massachusetts, and kept detailed household accounts from 1755 to 1770. Abigail was middle class, not wealthy, but comfortable. And her records are fascinating because she tracked candle usage with almost obsessive precision. In the winter of 1758, her household used 47 candles between November and February. That's roughly 3 candles per week. But she notes that 15 of those candles were used during a 2-week period when her husband was ill and needed light through the night. Without that illness, they would have used only 32 candles across 4 months, less than 2 per week. Think about what that means. 2 candles per week for an entire household. That's roughly 3 to 4 hours of light per week beyond what the hearthfire provided. Every other hour of every evening was spent in firelight alone, which was even dimmer than candlelight and less directional. Abigail's accounts show she was acutely aware of this economy. She'd note, "Lit candle for mending John's coat 1 hour. Lit candle for reading ledger 30 minutes. She was literally tracking the minutes of candlelight use. That's how precious it was. And the wealthy, their relationship with evening light was completely different. Wealthy plantation owners in Virginia or successful merchants in Boston might burn 10, 15, even 20 candles in an evening without thinking twice about it. They could afford to buy candles rather than make them. They could afford beeswax. They could afford spermaceti, which gave off the brightest, cleanest light available. Their evening gatherings, dinner parties, card games, musical performances happened in rooms bright enough to see faces clearly, to read music, to play cards without squinting. Meanwhile, 2 miles away, a farming family sat in a circle around a single tallow candle, straining to see their needlework. Same evening, same darkness outside, completely different lived experiences. And you know what's interesting? The wealthy people writing letters and diaries rarely mention light at all. It was so abundant for them that it wasn't worth noting. Meanwhile, people like Abigail Lyman were tracking every candle. The things you don't mention in your diary are sometimes more revealing than the things you do. Here's another aspect we haven't touched on: the fire hazard. Open flames in wooden houses with fabric curtains and furniture. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, actually. House fires were terrifyingly common in the 1700s, and candles were a major cause. A candle knocked over by a child. A candle left burning unattended. A candle placed too close to bed curtains. A candle touched by a woman's long skirt as she passed. Any of these could start a fire that would consume an entire house in minutes. So part of evening life was constant vigilance about flame. Never leave a candle unattended. Always place it in a sturdy holder. Keep it away from fabric. Check it frequently. Extinguish it completely before going to bed. Women, who were usually responsible for household management, carried this worry constantly. One careless moment could destroy everything your family owned. And in rural areas where houses were far apart and there was no fire department, a house fire usually meant total loss. At best, you might save some furniture and possessions. At worst, people died. So that single candle giving you 12 lumens of light, it was also a potential catastrophe sitting on your table every evening. Every single one. I think what gets me most about this whole thing is how much mental energy it required. We flip a switch and forget about it. The light is just there. Constant and reliable and safe and free, well, nearly free. We don't think about it at all. They had to think about it constantly. Calculate it, ration it, manage it, protect against its dangers, work around its limitations. Every evening activity had to be planned around available light. Every task had to be weighed against the cost of the candle required to accomplish it. Every moment of brightness was a conscious economic decision. That's exhausting just to think about, isn't it? And yet, they did it every single night for their entire lives. It was so normal that they barely complained about it in their writings. It was just how evening was. So when Sarah sits down in her circle of candlelight to begin her evening's work, the spinning or mending or whatever needs doing, she's not just sitting down to work. She's sitting down to a carefully calculated relationship with light itself. She knows exactly how long this candle will last. She knows what she needs to accomplish before it burns out. She knows how to position herself to make the most of those 12 dim lumens. She knows to watch for drafts, and trim the wick, and keep the children's hands away from the flame. She's doing all of this without even thinking about it, because it's muscle memory, habit, second nature. And that candle sitting in front of her, it represents hours of her autumn labor. It represents economic calculations about household resources. It represents choices made and deferred and reconsidered. It's not just light. It's much more complex than that. And what she does in that light, the work that happens in those few precious hours between supper and sleep, that's the story we're going to explore next. Because the evening work of women in the 1700s was remarkable, essential, and completely invisible to most histories. But we're going to see it, every stitch, every thread, every moment of it. The candle is burning. The work is waiting. Let's see what happened next. Hashtag part 5. Spinning and textile work. Listen. Do you hear it? It's a sound that filled almost every household evening in the 1700s. A soft rhythmic whirring. The gentle thump-thump of a treadle. The whisper of wool being drawn and twisted. The spinning wheel. If there's one sound that defined evening life for women in this era, it was that. Not conversation, though there was plenty of that. Not singing, though that happened too. It was the sound of fiber becoming thread, hour after hour, night after night, season after season. Because here's what most people don't understand about the 1700s. Almost everything your family wore, slept under, or used for cloth was made by hand, by women's hands, often in the evening, by that dim candlelight we just talked about. Let me show you what that actually meant. Sarah's supper bowls are cleared. Her single candle is burning, and now she sits down at her spinning wheel. But first, let's understand what spinning actually was, because we've lost the knowledge of it almost entirely. Spinning is the process of taking raw fiber, wool from sheep, flax from plants, sometimes cotton, and twisting it into continuous thread. Before you can weave cloth, before you can knit a stocking, before you can sew anything, you need thread. And thread comes from spinning. In our world, thread comes from factories. You buy it in neat little spools without thinking twice about it. But in the 1700s, every single inch of thread your family used had to be spun by someone. Usually by the women and girls of the household, and it took forever. Historical estimates suggest that spinning enough thread for one shirt, just one man's linen shirt, required approximately 20 to 30 hours of work. Think about that. 20 to 30 hours of sitting at a wheel, drawing fiber, twisting, winding, repeating one shirt. Now multiply that by all the shirts, shifts, stockings, sheets, tablecloths, towels, and other linens a family needed. The numbers become staggering. So evening spinning wasn't optional or leisurely. It was absolutely necessary just to keep the family clothed. Sarah would have started learning to spin when she was maybe 6 or 7 years old, first on a simple drop spindle, a handheld tool, and then graduating to the wheel once her coordination improved. By the time she was 12, she could spin while half asleep. By the time she was 20, her hands moved with barely any conscious thought. And now at 40-some, sitting down to her wheel is as automatic as breathing. She pulls a bit of wool from the bundle beside her. It's been carded, brushed until all the fibers align earlier in the day. She attaches it to the thread already on the spindle. Her foot finds the treadle. She begins the rhythm. Press, release, press, release. The wheel spins. Her hands draw the fiber out, letting it twist as it feeds onto the spindle. It's a dance of sorts. Foot and hands working in perfect coordination, never stopping, never thinking, just doing. And while she spins, she can talk. She can supervise her daughters. She can listen to her husband read from the Bible or the newspaper. She can think about tomorrow's tasks or remember last week's events. This is the genius of spinning as evening work. It keeps the hands busy and productive, while the mind is free to wander or engage with family. But let's talk about her daughters, because this is where the training system of the 1700s becomes visible. Sarah has 3 daughters. The eldest, Mary, is 16. She's at her own spinning wheel working on flax, which is more difficult than wool, requires a lighter touch, produces finer thread. The middle daughter, Elizabeth, is 12. She's still learning, so she's carding wool, preparing it for spinning. This is important work, but less skilled, and it can be done by candlelight with less eye strain. The youngest daughter, who's old enough to help, 8-year-old Hannah, is winding thread onto bobbins from yesterday's spinning. Simple, repetitive work that a child can master. This is how the knowledge passed down, not through formal instruction or written manuals, through sitting together evening after evening, watching, imitating, gradually taking on more complex tasks. Mary learned by watching Sarah for 10 years before she got her own wheel. Elizabeth is learning by watching both of them. Hannah is learning by watching all 3. By the time Hannah is 16, she'll be as skilled as her mother, and she'll teach her own daughters the same way. An unbroken chain of knowledge passed through countless generations, maintained in evening hours by candlelight. Now I want you to understand something about the volume of work involved here. One historian who studied colonial household production calculated that a typical rural family needed approximately 800 hours of spinning per year to meet their basic textile needs. 800 hours. That's the equivalent of a modern full-time job. 40 hours per week for 20 weeks. Except it was spread across all the women and girls in the household. And it mostly happened in the evenings because daytime was filled with cooking, cleaning, animal care, gardening, and a dozen other tasks. If Sarah and her eldest daughter each spun for 2 hours every evening, that's roughly 28 hours per week between them. Across a year, that's about 1,400 hours. Plenty to meet family needs with some to sell or trade. But that's 2 hours every single evening. Not most evenings. Not when they felt like it. Every evening. Think about your own evenings. Do you do anything every single evening for 2 hours? Anything at all? They did. They had no choice. And here's what makes it even more demanding. The quality standards. Thread wasn't just thread. It had to be even. The same thickness throughout. If it varied, the woven cloth would be weak in some spots, thick in others, useless, basically. It had to be twisted just right, too loose, and it would fall apart, too tight, and it would be stiff and hard to work with. And it had to be clean. Any vegetable matter or dirt worked into the thread would show in the final cloth. Producing good thread required skill, attention, and consistency. It wasn't something you could do carelessly while your mind wandered completely. You needed the balance of automatic hand movement and conscious quality control. Sarah could feel with her fingers if the thread was getting too thick or thin. She could sense if the twist was right. She didn't need to look at it constantly, which was good because candlelight wasn't great for seeing fine details anyway. She relied on touch and experience. This was expertise, real valuable expertise. But because it was women's work and happened in the home, it was considered natural rather than skilled labor, which is honestly insulting. Spinning was a craft that took years to master. Let me tell you about a specific woman whose spinning played a crucial role in American history, though you've probably never heard of her. Her name was Betsy Hager, and she lived in Connecticut during the Revolutionary War. When the British blockade cut off imported cloth and thread, the Continental Army desperately needed textiles for uniforms. Betsy organized 42 women in her town into what she called a spinning society. They met twice weekly in the afternoon, but most of their work happened in their own homes in the evenings. Over the course of the war, her network produced enough thread to make uniforms for nearly 300 soldiers. 300 men clothed because women spent their evenings spinning by candlelight. And Betsy Hager's name appears in exactly 3 historical documents. 3, despite the fact that her work directly supported the war effort. Meanwhile, we know the names of dozens of minor military officers who never saw combat. That tells you everything about whose work was considered worth recording. But spinning wasn't the only evening textile work. Let's talk about sewing and mending. After the spinning came weaving, usually done by specialists or by women during daylight hours when you could see the pattern. But once you had cloth, it needed to be transformed into useful items. And that transformation happened largely in the evening. Sarah's middle daughter, Elizabeth, who's not quite skilled enough for her own spinning wheel, is mending tonight. There's a basket beside her filled with items needing repair. Her father's work shirt with a torn seam. Her brother's stockings with holes in the heels. A sheet that's worn thin in the middle. Nothing got thrown away, ever. You mended until there was literally nothing left to mend. And mending by candlelight was challenging work. You needed to see the hole or tear clearly enough to stitch it properly. You needed to match thread to fabric. You needed to make your stitches even and strong. Elizabeth holds her work close to the candle. Too close, and she risks singed fabric. Not close enough, and she can't see what she's doing. She's learned through experience exactly where that sweet spot is. Her stitches are small and neat. Sarah taught her that. If you're going to spend time mending, Sarah always says, make the repair strong enough that you don't have to mend the same spot again next month. That's the practical wisdom of someone who's been doing this for decades. Every stitch matters. Every repair needs to last. Here's something beautiful about these evening textile sessions. They created space for talk. Hands were busy, but mouths were free. This was when mothers taught daughters about more than just spinning and sewing. This was when family stories got told. When moral lessons got passed down. When questions got asked and answered. Mother, why do we twist wool and flax in opposite directions? Because wool is springy and needs a tight twist. Flax is smooth and needs a loose twist. Your grandmother taught me that when I was younger than you. Mother, when will I get my own wheel? when you can spin an even thread for 2 hours without me correcting you? Same as your sister earned hers. These weren't idle conversations. This was education happening, not book learning. Most of these girls weren't learning to read, but life learning, practical knowledge, family history, values, all woven into the rhythm of spinning and sewing. And sisters talked to each other, confided things they might not say in daylight, made plans, shared secrets. The intimacy of working together evening after evening created bonds that lasted lifetimes. Now, let's talk about what happened when the work was truly endless. Because sometimes it was. If you were preparing for a wedding, you needed to produce an enormous amount of textiles, sheets, towels, tablecloths, clothing. A bride was expected to bring these items into her marriage, and producing them required months of evening work. Or if someone in the family was sick and couldn't work their share, the others had to pick up the slack. More hours at the wheel, more hours mending, less sleep. Or if the family was particularly poor and needed to sell spun thread or woven cloth for cash income, the evening work increased beyond household needs. In these cases, women might spin for 3 or 4 hours every evening, might sew by candlelight until their eyes watered and their backs ached and their fingers were raw. One woman in New Hampshire in 1776 wrote in her diary, "Spun until the candle burned entire away, and I could no longer see my hands. Started to rise, and found I could not straighten my back without pain. I am 27, and feel like 70. 27, 27 years old, feeling 70 because of the endless evening work. But she did it. They all did it because the alternative was going without, going cold, going hungry because you had nothing to trade. The work was brutal, but not doing the work was worse. Here's what strikes me most about all of this, the sheer invisibility of it. Thousands of hours of skilled labor happening in dim candlelight in homes all across the colonies, all across America, keeping families clothed, creating trade goods, supporting the economy, essential work. And it's almost completely absent from historical records. We have elaborate accounts of tobacco harvests, and shipping manifests, and political meetings. But the spinning that happened in those same households, barely mentioned. The mending, the sewing, the constant textile production, footnotes at best. Because it was just what women did. It was expected. It wasn't considered remarkable enough to record, but it was remarkable. Every evening, women sat down to work that required genuine skill, that took years to master, that was absolutely essential to daily life. And they did it by light so dim, we can barely imagine it. After a full day of other labor, training the next generation while they worked. That's not just remarkable, that's extraordinary. Sarah's candle is burning lower now. She's been spinning for nearly 2 hours. The pile of spun thread on her spindle has grown. Her daughter Elizabeth has finished mending 3 items and started on a 4th. Mary has produced a good length of fine linen thread, and little Hannah, who's been winding bobbins, is starting to yawn. It's getting close to the children's bedtime. But before they can sleep, there's another set of evening rituals to be done. Because the work of putting a household to bed, getting children washed and settled and safe through the night, that's its own kind of labor, its own set of skills and concerns. And it happened every evening without fail, no matter how tired everyone was. So, let's follow Sarah as she starts to wind down the textile work and shift into those final evening tasks. Let's see what it took to tuck a family in for the night in the 1700s, when darkness was absolute and cold could be dangerous, and every child going to sleep safely was a small victory. The spinning wheel is slowing. The bedtime routines are beginning. Stay with us. Hashtag part 6. Bedtime rituals and children. Wait, before we move into the bedtime routines, I need to tell you about something that happened in the quiet spaces between all this work. Something that almost never made it into the historical record, but was absolutely vital to women's survival. There were moments, rare, stolen, precious moments, when a woman's evening wasn't entirely consumed by labor, when she could claim a few minutes for herself. And what she did with those minutes tells us more about women's inner lives in the 1700s than almost anything else. Let me show you what I mean. It's later now, maybe 9. The younger children are asleep. We'll get to how that happened in a moment. Sarah's husband has dozed off in his chair by the fire, which honestly happened most evenings after a day of physical farm work. The house has settled into that particular kind of quiet that only comes when most people are sleeping. And Sarah, who's been working since before dawn, who's cooked and cleaned and spun and supervised, who's been needed by someone every moment of the day, Sarah has 15 minutes that belong only to her. What does she do with them? She writes a letter. Now, this might not seem remarkable to us. We fire off messages constantly without thinking. But for Sarah, this is something else entirely. This is connection. This is her voice preserved. This is her claiming space in a world that mostly demanded her silence. Letter writing in the evening was incredibly common among women who could write, which wasn't all women, but more than you might think. Literacy rates for women in New England by the mid-1700s were surprisingly high, maybe 60 to 70%. Lower in the southern colonies, but still significant. And for literate women, letters were lifelines. Because here's the thing about women's lives in this period. They were isolated. If you lived on a farm, your nearest neighbor might be a mile away. You might see people at church on Sunday, but that was group interaction, not intimate conversation.